Howdy. Well, I believe what happened is that on the last chapter of my father's childhood, maybe called chapter 13, I started talking about my mother's childhood. I didn't have the photos organized, and so anyway, I started telling a little of her story. Now I have some photos, so I think I'm going to try and tell her story in a little better sequence with some things you can actually look at. So uh, I have a book here that was organized at her funeral, actually, and I learned some things about her childhood when she passed away. Uh, she passed away September 9th, 1985, 27 years ago. It's the end of August 2012 as I sit here. Who knows when you might watch this? Now, my mother was born Anne R. Jester, Anne Rife. Rife was her maiden name, R-I-F-E. And she was born, it says in this book, at Graff, Nebraska. I have no idea where Graff is. I believe she was primarily raised in Omaha. She was born March 16th, 1906. So when she passed away, she was just not quite 80 years old. And I'm 81 and a half as we speak here. Her father's name was Jack Ripe, so apparently I was named after her father. And her mother was Goldie Thomberg was her maiden name. And I was an only child. And my mother had two brothers and one sister. It so happens, you may recall, that her father was a meat packer in Omaha. And it also happens that in the year of her birth, 1906, just over a century ago, to me now, a very famous book was published. It was called The Jungle, written by a guy named Upton Sinclair. And he believed he was writing about terrible conditions faced by immigrants. They're working in barbaric conditions in factories and so on, living in slums, mostly women and children, and just awful, awful life conditions. But it so happened that he had worked for some months to learn about some of these things in meat packing companies. He worked in a couple that are still fairly famous, and I wrote them down here somewhere. Um, Armour and Swift and Company. Armour Meat and Swift and Company. Today, I don't know about your time, but today are still big meat packers in America. I don't know that he did this in Omaha. He may have done it in Chicago. But what became famous in his book was the horrendous disease potential of the meat. There were no sanitary conditions at all. There was every kind of impurities in all of the meat. The conditions were just horrible. And that became very famous. His book was serialized in popular magazines. It was a bestseller. And what we know now as all our food and drug laws came about because of that book. So at the time my mother was born, her father's profession, meatpacking, was held to be just absolutely criminal. He was a radical right-wing Jew, and I don't know if his meatpacking was kosher or not. I imagine it was, but it probably had all these other sins and problems connected with it. And I know for a fact that she said he never ever brought home anything like lunch meat or any of that. Very few things would he bring to feed his family or that he would eat. He knew the truth. Um, okay, let's show you a couple pictures here. This was my mother, and it says on the back, born November 16th, 1906, no, March 16th, baby Ann Wright. So, very cute baby. And here's her mother and father and her, 9 months old. And here she is with her grandfather. It was on her grandfather's birthday. His name was Mr. Cole. So, parents, Jack and Goldie, and Mr. Cole. Trying to keep these things straight so I can show them in order is always a challenge for me. Okay, now I don't know a lot about her childhood. I know almost nothing about it. But very strict home. Mother not allowed to work outside the home. And in those days, working in the home was 16-hour days. Everything was hand washed, um, hand squeezed, hand rinsed, and in the winter dried inside and in the rest of the year dried outside on clotheslines. A lot of sewing, a lot of clothes making, no supermarkets, so buying a few different things, coffee, sugar, salt, and whatever meat and so on was available in the season wherever you lived. Omaha was a fairly large city, and because it was such a meat packing center, there was a lot of trucking of farm produce. So there was a lot of food available, relatively speaking, in the early part of the 20th century when this was going on. But it was hard work raising 4 children. Um, Her father was very filled with thou shalt nots. I don't know whether he was physically abusive or not. So he didn't want his sons to ever date or marry anyone but far-right Jewish women. One son fell in love with a non-Jewish woman and married her. And let's see. Okay, here's another picture of her father and her mother, Goldie. And this was the brother, Lewis, who married the non-Jewish woman. And this was the other brother. I knew this one. Bennett was his name. And Bennett obviously was in World War II and came to my mother's funeral and eventually ended up a stockbroker in Texas. He worked for Greyhound for many, many years. I think he was her favorite. And this is Rose, my mother's sister, who never married and who died, I believe, in her 30s. May she and Lewis, the brother that was the outcast, probably suffered the most from her father's extreme views. My mother chose to never mention to me that she was born and raised in any religion, much less Jewish. And I'm fairly convinced she may not have ever mentioned it to my father, though they spent their entire adult lives together. And in Helena, Montana, I don't believe there was a Jewish church at the time, but had there been, I don't believe she would have gone. I think she wished to not be involved in organized religion, and I'm very grateful for that. Okay, so now she was very bright, I believe the oldest child, and very smart, very hardworking, very good in school. And as I mentioned, she wanted to be a nurse. And so when she graduated from high school in Lincoln, Nebraska, probably this may have been 1922, around there, somewhere. She was probably 18. Um, that might have been 1924, actually. And so it was in the middle of the roaring 20s. And I found 3 pictures of her. This is in some kind of a costume. No idea what that meant or even how old. All it says on the back is me. And I don't know how old she is. Teens, maybe. Okay. And I believe there's a date on this, and it may be 1927. Um, I think it was about the time she graduated from high school, or maybe as she finished her nurse's work. And then there's this one. Again, it says me, July 27th. Hot young chick. Very good looking and perfect for the roaring 20s, I believe. Okay, you probably recall that she went to Lincoln, Nebraska to become a nurse, and her father came and grabbed her and took her back to Omaha and said, "You can't become a nurse." She said, "The hell I can't," and went back to Lincoln and managed to become a very high grade nurse. And I believe she refused to have any serious boyfriends. And I think part of the reason was that there were no male nurses then. So the males in the medical school at Lincoln were going to be doctors. So they were kind of elite, and they had all of these male egos. Now, this was at the height of chauvinism, and women were certainly at a few might be called second class, but most were perceived as third, fourth, and fifth class. They were treated as if they were servants or slaves of males, and the males talked. And when 2 couples would go out together, the 2 males would sit together on the transportation system, carriage or early old car, and the 2 women then would sit in the back seat, and so on and so on. And I believe she was unimpressed by that. So in any case, she decided to go to Alaska and be a nurse in Alaska. Alaska had very few people in it other than Eskimos, the Native Americans there. It was just kind of getting started, and I don't believe it was a state yet. It was a territory, and it was hard to get to and hard to survive there, and just beginning to build a little crude medical. And it really challenged her and excited her. So she got a train ticket, and to get to Alaska, she had to go through Helena, Montana. And her best girlfriend was in Helena. She'd fallen for some goof on a motorcycle, and he put her on the back of the motorcycle, and they got to Helena before the motorcycle quit. And this is her. This is Edith Ryan. And he was kind of major in my life. My father wasn't much in my life, but Carl Ryan was in my life a lot. And I worked for him, and he talked me into going to the university finally. So my mother Ann stopped in Helena to visit her girlfriend, Edith. And there was this old Indian fort that had a VA hospital. It was called Fort Harrison, 5 miles outside of Helena. And it was really for World War I gas victims. They were up in the mountains right just beside the Continental Divide. Helena's right at the base of the Continental Divide. And thin, cold air. And so I think the theory was they wouldn't live a long time and save the government money when they passed away. Anyway, hospital was full of those, and they were having problems finding enough nurses, and they heard about my mother and talked her into coming out and being a temporary nurse. Now, there was one hospital in Helena called St. Peter's, where it turned out I was born, and I found this letter written November 21st, 1928. That was a little over a year before the Great Depression struck. And it says, "Dear Miss Rife, just a note to ask you if you would be interested in the position of night supervisor. Miss Mills told me this morning that she may leave the 1st of February, but does not know for sure. I would love to have you. She receives $100 per month with one night off a week. 6 12-hour shifts. Night supervisor, only hospital in Helena, $25 a week." This is between you and I and the gatepost. I hate to lose Miss Mills, but if I could get you, there would not be a loss. I mean this too. She does not sleep well, and it seems nurses cannot stand night duty for a very long period. Well, bye-bye. Let me hear from you soon. Sincerely yours, Frida Consignoring, RN. Did you ever get a letter from a future employer like that? Anyway, let's take a look here. I think I'm going on just a little bit longer than I've been. We've given up on YouTube, so I have a couple more photographs to show you. I think I told you that my mother met my father, Harold, as she was an emergency nurse at Fort Harrison. He was an orderly there. One of his older brothers, Glenn, was a World War I gas victim and was a patient. And one of his other older brothers, Roy, was an orderly there. Orderlies were sort of male helpers to the nurses. And so my father was a 19 roaring 20s hot young guy with a band and a banjo and a lead singer and in a nightclub during Prohibition. That was very romantic. He was a cowboy. My mother had never met anybody like Harold. He was one of the Jester brothers from Oklahoma, 5 horsemen. So she fell in love and married him, and she had this ticket to Anchorage, Alaska. So she went on their honeymoon alone, and he stayed in Great Falls, and he washed dishes in a saloon there till she came back. And I think she managed to borrow a few dollars from her father and make a down payment on a home early in the Depression. The Depression started in late fall 1929 and didn't hit Helena right away, and never hit it very hard. Um, Now, this is my mother's marriage photo. This is what she looked like then, 1928, 29, along in there. And she's in her early 20s, 23, 24. And this is my father, Harold, when he got married. And sort of a typical male from the roaring 20s. I don't mean to get ahead. I was born a few hours after Christmas, December 26, 1930, and they'd been married, I don't know, not quite 2 years. And so here I am in Harold's holding me, and I'm pretty young. And this is kind of the picture of my mother through most of my childhood. And she became one of the most famous nurses in the Northwest. And eventually we'll get to that story and all the fun stuff of the Great Depression and blah, blah, blah. So I hope your life is wonderful. Hannah and I are having just a terrific, exciting life here in Nowhere, Missouri. And we'll talk to you soon.